Hey everyone! Welcome back to Story Hive channel, your go-to place for the best Reddit stories on the web. If you love diving into amazing tales, crazy confessions, and heartwarming moments from Reddit, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Let's jump into today's story. My parents told my brother to take my house because I don't have a family. I'm a single man in my early 30s. I have a brother who's 29 and already has 4 kids. He had his first at 22, the second followed a year later, the third came 2 years after that, and the fourth was born a couple of months ago. His wife, my sister-in-law, and I do not get along. She always tries to get a rise out of me by acting superior and then turns into an extreme self-victimizing drama queen if I retaliate. She can cry in an instant and put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from just about anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly how she really is and just don't care. She's very good looking, I'll give her that, but she's so awful that I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get any sort of job, even though she has a college degree, and my mother willingly helps with the kids all day. This means their finances are entirely dependent on my brother, which also means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. Privacy is a bit of an issue with all of them under one roof in a 3-bedroom house built in the 60s. Growing up, my younger brother was also the obvious favorite. We're 3 years apart in age, but he developed a superiority complex because I was badly punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way. Back then, it was obvious my parents cared for him a lot more because he got the lion's share of everything unless people called them out on it, which did happen a fair bit by other family members. That's why my parents packed us all up and moved us about 150 miles away from them, so they would generally only see us on holidays, since it was a 3-hour drive. My brother got physically abusive towards me on a number of occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit it was rather funny to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were present. We had relatives who were very nosy and loved gossiping, so my parents did their best to hide what was really going on and threatened to take all my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school yet when I moved out, but couchsurfing was far better than living with them. I was low contact ever since leaving home. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I really didn't care. From that point on, I would usually only see my parents and brother on holidays like the rest of the family. The start of the 2020 pandemic was not kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I really loved. As the lease was ending, my roommate left early to move back in with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize to an extreme. I really shouldn't have rented a place that was so expensive, but I liked living the high life until that life wasn't kind to me. I realized I should have been living somewhere far cheaper, so I could have saved more money to fall back on. But I had a plan. I own a truck simply because I've always loved trucks, so I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck just so I could live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living out of it far longer than I ever thought. I originally hoped to live out of the camper at my parents' house where my brother and his family still reside as well. But when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they told me they had a full house and didn't want me there. Plus, we hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they would only agree to let me park my camper there if I paid them basically what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park my camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I could find a new job. I might as well be living in an apartment with that rent price they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement. My sister-in-law thought it was absolutely hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her in pointing out and mocking me while calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck/camper in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night that I had nowhere else to go. I felt scared out of my mind that someone might try to break in. Suffice to say, I didn't sleep well that night. There was nowhere else I could go as any other relatives that owned houses were fairly far away, and all my friends were apartment people. I was pretty attached to my area as well, so I didn't want to just leave. I'd also had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment. It was the only way I could still get my mail. Finding a stable place to park was pretty difficult. I went looking around to try and find a job similar to my old one. It took months of living the nomadic camper life. During that time, I had to deal with a lot. Everything from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be within an HOA. I wasn't even parked on a street with houses, and when I questioned what HOA they were referring to, they got incredibly belligerent and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway just to avoid the trouble. In order to have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bag for recharging my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator, and generators are noisy and require fuel. Anyway, I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail. I worked retail while in college and promised myself never again, though I was nearly ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money, but I had no stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to still be jobless when it ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind. I had little else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep note of where I could park and what local public bathrooms I could use. I kind of envy that the Japanese have public bathhouses. We could really use stuff like that over here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse in old employee parking spaces that no one else seemed to bother using because they were so far in the back that the area was borderline forgotten. My boss, the company owner, actually liked this arrangement because I was willingly available to take any shift I could get, as long as I had enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I'm not exactly sure if this was legal, but no one bothered us about it the entire time I lived back there. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers. There were a few, but the security guards escorted them out. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me and was working virtually every day of the week. My boss let me plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office except for the janitor and security guard. Beyond that, I usually had to shower at a friend's apartment or at my local gym, as the camper didn't have a shower in it, only a portable toilet, and I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a nasty chore. So, I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could go in to use the bathroom there at any hour. I was even on a first-name basis with the night security guard. He's since become one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater. Summers were not fun, though. The camper didn't have AC, so I had to get a used portable air conditioner just to make it bearable. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned some new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway through this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I got from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work and, just 2 miles away, found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property. I managed to get it for $10,000 less than the asking price. Somehow, I used nearly my entire savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house to take the camper off and set it up in the backyard as its own little building, just in case I want to use it again. When I was fully settled in the house, I was dumb enough to brag about it on my social media. My family saw the post, and that's where this stuff really starts. After a few weeks, my parents and brother, along with his family, came to visit completely unannounced to tour my home. I didn't even give them my address, so how they found out where I live, I still don't know. None of my friends have fessed up, and no prior family members visited me before that. So I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home or something. It really wouldn't surprise me. Once I opened the door, they practically all shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists and started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and my sister-in-law had this creepy smirk that she was repeatedly flashing me. It was only later that I figured out why, and it made me madder than a bull on steroids that just got stung by a hornet. My parents were constantly talking about how I had so much extra space now, and how it was too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. Sure, not now, but maybe someday. My brother kept remarking about how there was more space than at our parents' house and how my house was closer to his job too. Red flags all around, I know. Eventually, my brother asked me to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out onto the front porch. That's what finally made me realize they planned something. My brother, let's call him Dan for the sake of simplicity, said the house was too much for me alone and that I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with kid number 4 and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already had the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they lived in the main house. I'd like to point out that Dan never once spoke of offering rent. Mind you, if he's got a good job. He also started talking about how there would be changes and even curfews, and that I couldn't just walk in at any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I'd think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But Dan lost his marbles long ago thanks to my parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I'd rent my house or parts of my house to him. Other people, maybe, just so I could pay the mortgage off more easily, but certainly not him or his nasty wife. I've heard of this exact kind of situation in videos online many times, and never once did I think I'd actually live it because I thought it was so ludicrous. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law do all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic entitled crazies. So I picked up my phone and set it to start recording, then just held on to it. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I'd done this and just sat there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. He then went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal and trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally showed my backbone and said, "Hell no," and I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I'd rarely ever raised my voice to him on that level because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, not theirs. My spine can be as shiny as it was here. I stood up and told him that my house was not up for grabs and acting like I'd let him move in just because they want it won't make it happen. I bought my house for me, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me and said that I didn't deserve the house and he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed back in his face and said that was total bull because I worked hard to be able to buy my house. Of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids and I don't need all the space, so I might as well give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything, and he never even offered to pay me rent if I let him move in. I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in it. Then Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first. My parents told my brother to take my house because I don't have a family. They broke my locks to move in while I wasn't home. After I kicked my parents, brother, and sister-in-law out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went to my social media and told the story to the whole family. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted some time ago, and I put my own profile on private. I posted about it because I knew that the first thing my family would do when they got home is try to twist the event to make me the villain, and I was exactly right. But I had about an hour to get started before them and had video evidence to back up my story about what they'd done. No, I don't plan on showing the video here, so don't ask. Being preemptive worked because I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law must have been all set to write their own post, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie much. My parents, Dan, and sister-in-law had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Plenty of others knew how entitled they already were, so what happened was something they all quickly understood and accepted. There was one person in particular who called me. I don't know who they were, But they ranted at me that I was a horrible brother and I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. This didn't repeat. The week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch, just like they said they would in their prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy and also pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to shove their way in again, but I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it and even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down and then, in her most sickly sweet tone, asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to F off and never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked me why I couldn't just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and bluntly said I do not love him as a brother because he treated me like crap for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother. I then told them to leave, or I'd be calling the police ASAP. I then told they all left surprisingly easily apart from my mother's loud crying and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over. I guess I should have taken their threats more seriously because they had other plans up their sleeves. That Friday evening, I came home to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family. They were in the process of moving their stuff in. When Dan saw me, he just waved with this smug grin. I was furious and told them to stop immediately. Sister-in-law, with her usual smugness, said they were moving in whether I liked it or not. Then she tilted her head, puckered her lips, and said, "It's okay because Mommy allowed it, and you should always listen to what Mommy says." I was seething with rage just hearing those words and looking at her idiotic face. I locked myself in my truck and called the cops right away. When sister-in-law saw what I was doing, she started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, saying I couldn't do this to her because she and Dan needed the house. She even cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I shouted back, "F Dan. It's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key my truck unless I stopped calling the police. Thankfully, the 911 operator heard all of this through the slightly open window. I told sister-in-law if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her. She was smart enough to retreat when the police arrived. Dan and sister-in-law, along with their kids, had locked themselves inside my house. I explained everything to the cops and showed them my new driver's license with my current address. At the front door, I saw they'd changed the lock, and the old one was lying on the porch with the center drilled out. A Harbor Freight drill and a full drill bit set were left right next to it. Could they have been more obvious? I pointed out the broken lock and drill to the police, then gave them a rundown of the previous events. It turned out Dan had called our parents because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately started lying, saying I'd agreed to rent my house to Dan and his family. I told them that was an easily provable lie. Dan and sister-in-law finally emerged from my house with some papers. They were smug, thinking they'd outsmarted me, but they'd drawn up a fake rental agreement. The signature was obviously forged. I told them it was blatant fraud and that the cops would easily figure that out. I warned them that Dan could even lose his job, which is his only means of supporting his family. I said I would get a lawyer and sue for any damages and also call CPS if necessary. Dan looked pale and scared, but my mother stepped in and insisted I should just let Dan live there and move into the camper myself. I shouted back that if she thought it was such a great idea, she should do it for Dan and let him have her house instead. The cops separated my mother and me, and I told them to remove everyone right now or I'd press charges. I said they drilled out my front door lock to break in. The lease papers were obvious fakes with a badly forged signature, and I had video evidence of sister-in-law attacking me. Those were felonies, and if they didn't leave, I'd pursue every legal avenue. I gave them one chance to get out. My mother eventually surrendered and said she'd end it. She went to sister-in-law and spoke quietly, while my father talked to Dan. Sister-in-law started loudly crying, ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti. An officer told her to pick up the pieces or face a littering citation. By this point, the cops had their "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Dan had to tell his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing about not getting his own room. In a final pathetic attempt, Dan, sister-in-law, and the kids gathered in a sad family hug routine, all with pleading looks. Sister-in-law rubbed her pregnant belly, and Dan made the saddest face he could muster, begging me not to do this. I didn't waver and told them to keep packing. Dan yelled, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I laughed maniacally and told him that what he was doing was stealing, not sharing. No amount of crying would make me let his family move in. He was no brother of mine, just an entitled prick. Dan started cursing me out until the cops told him to cool it, or he'd be arrested. He looked a mix of afraid and furious. I asked the cops if they could stick around until Dan and his family left, and they said they would. Soon, more officers arrived, increasing the police presence. My parents seemed to realize they couldn't force me into anything and quickly packed up. Dan reluctantly gave me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door. Instead of handing them over, he threw them down the street into a storm drain. One of the cops scolded him, making him retrieve them from the drain. When Dan handed the keys to me, he just grumbled and slammed them into my hand. I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother threatened to disown me, which I couldn't have cared less about. I sarcastically replied that not being invited to family holidays where I was treated like crap was hardly a threat. They had treated me poorly all my life, and if Dan ever needed an organ donor, he wouldn't get one from me. I told them to do like they always told me to do when mistreated and just suck it up. Final update. As you may know, sister-in-law started making passive-aggressive posts on social media after she had her fourth baby in November. She kept complaining about how tired she was of living with my parents and needed her own house. I was dismissive because, frankly, living through their antics had made me jaded. I invited half the family for a Christmas Eve party at my house, and everyone came despite the long drive. They praised me for working hard to get my house and apologized for everything I'd gone through. I sheepishly admitted that I was attached to living here due to better job opportunities. The party was wonderful, one of the best I'd had in years. I even enjoyed a great Christmas album by Ray Charles, thanks to my uncle. But the peace didn't last. About 2 hours into the party, guess who showed up? My parents, brother, and sister-in-law walked in without knocking, acting like they belonged there. I told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay, claiming they brought gifts. One of my uncles, who had always been close to my mother, stood up and yelled at them. He said they didn't deserve to be in my home after everything they tried to pull. Several other relatives backed him up. My grandparents, who had always hidden their favoritism, also weighed in. They said my parents had never disappointed them more than this past year. They needed to treat me like a son if they wanted any chance of being in my life again. They told Dan and sister-in-law to stop whining and let it go. Sister-in-law threw a tantrum, crying about how unfair it was that I had a house while she had 4 kids and needed more space. She even complained about how she should be living here and not me. I pointed out that she was a lousy mother, letting my mother do most of the parenting while she wasted Dan's money and drank too much. I even joked that I was surprised her baby didn't get drunk from her breast milk. It was a low blow, but she had it coming. I told her to get a job, save money, and stop relying on my parents. My brother's eldest kid started kicking and screaming at me, accusing me of being the bad guy. My brother had to pull him away, but it only escalated into a family intervention. Sister-in-law, Dan, and their kids were all crying, and Dan looked like a wreck, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He was thoroughly humiliated, and their reputation was shattered. Once my parents, brother, and sister-in-law left in defeat, the party resumed. Everyone stayed the night, and I let some sleep in the camper. It turned out to be a great guest house. After Christmas, sister-in-law stopped her passive-aggressive posts and deleted the old ones. But she soon complained about how she tried to convince my parents to get a camper like mine so they could use the house, leaving the camper in the backyard for Dan's family. My parents shot down that idea, and the post was quickly removed. She hasn't posted much since then. Life has mellowed for me. I've invited friends over for poker nights, and although I'm terrible at poker, we enjoy good times, beer, and junk food. I might look into dating this summer. My camper now sits idle, and I sometimes spend time in it, reminiscing about the 2 years I lived there. Maybe one day I'll use it for camping, a new experience for me. That's pretty much the end of it. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law have been avoiding me, acting like I don't exist. I don't mind. It's better this way. But I'm sure they'll come back in some way eventually. If anything notable happens, I'll make another post if this account is still active. Thanks for tuning in to today's Reddit story. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out on more amazing stories. See you next time.